Thank you so much, Chaim, for organizing this and welcoming us so warmly, and for all of you sharing this day with us. We're a little jet-lagged coming from Canada. My name is Deidre Butler, and this is...
I'm Betina Appel Kuzmarov.
And we are colleagues on a research project on Jewish divorce in Canada. And so we'll be speaking together today. So we're very pleased to be part of this opening panel. And in following the previous historically and geographically situated accounts, we contribute here a contemporary but equally situated account from Canada. We thought it would be helpful to have some basic demographic information of a contrast between Canada and the United States and Israel to situate our discussion of Jewish divorce in Canada. For example, the Canadian Jewish population is 329,500. Is there a way to
can we
make
lower
the
the
light better?
Yes. Go down the sheet.
There's not much of this, but still it'd be good for you to see.
Is that better?
Is that a little better? Yes. We're happy to share the slides if that would be helpful. So as I just mentioned, we're looking at 329,500 Jews in Canada, while the American Jewish population is almost 16 times that at 5.3 million. And this, of course, dramatically contrasts with Israel, where almost 75% of citizens are Jewish and where Jewish law is normative for the Jewish population. These demographics are only part of the story. It's helpful to think about Canada versus the US because the history of Jews in North America are intertwined in important ways. In Canada and the US, unlike Israel, family law is governed by civil law, which accommodate religious observance.
And the story of North American Jewry is at least in part a story of denominational history in relation to patterns and various national mythologies that can contribute to or actually delay integration in either the Canadian or American context. In terms of religious observance and denominational makeup, as you can see on the slide, Canadian patterns follow the American experience of US Jewry coalescing around four main denominations: Orthodoxy, Conservatism, Reform, and Reconstructionist. But scholars often talk about the fact that Canada skews a little bit more traditional and perhaps 20 years behind in the religious trends compared to the US. Thus, conservatism is the largest movement in Canada versus reform in the United States, but the Canadian conservative movement looks more traditional than the US movement does in terms of its slower embrace of denominational changes. Modern Orthodoxy thrives in Canada with growth in both synagogues and schools, and the Haredi community is growing even faster in particular Hasidic areas.
What is quite striking about Canada as well is how the Jewish population clusters in cities. Toronto, with 189,000 Jews in Canada, is Canada's largest Jewish community and has 57% of all Jews in Canada. It's the 15th largest Jewish community in the world. Montreal, where I was from, sorry, it's a Canadian joke about Montrealers being, the only real Montrealers. Okay. Montreal, which was previously Canada's largest Jewish community, is now our second largest, with only 90,000 Jews. It is one of Canada's oldest Jewish communities, dating to the 18th century, and it is distinctive in that 24.5% of Montreal Jews are Sephardi, and 25% speak French. Ottawa, where we are from, is Canada's fourth largest community and has only 14,000 Jews, or 4.25% of the Jewish population. And thinking about these three cities, we have three very different settings for religious divorce. In Ottawa, there is no Orthodox Beit Din, and divorces are most often completed by proxy with the assistance of Beit Din in Montreal, Toronto, or Brooklyn. Both Montreal and Toronto each have their own Beit Din that serve as the official Orthodox court for each city. And the experience of divorce in these cities, however, are largely framed by the practices of each local Beit Din and their respective interpretations of the place and efficacy of prenuptial agreements and Canadian federal law.
There are also several ways in which civil divorce law and the remedies available under it are distinct from the US and Israel. First, in Canada, marriage and divorce fall constitutionally under federal jurisdiction, while the provinces can decide how to solemnize marriages. This means that there's one law regarding divorce across Canada, although separation, common law marriage will vary by province. This has made it possible for Canadian activists for push to changes to federal law. This activism resulted in something called Section 21.1 of the Divorce Act of 1990. It's a provision that allows a spouse who currently has a divorce proceeding before the court to file with the court an affidavit that there is a religious barrier to remarriage in their case. If that barrier is not removed, the court will dismiss all applications filed by that party under the Act. And either that or they have to prove to the court that the barriers have been removed. Further, the refusing spouse can actually subvert this process if they can claim that there are genuine grounds that they cannot remove those barriers. In the United States, however, family law is state law alone, and New York most prominently is the state which has laws which address the get issue directly.
Given our perspectives from law and religion, as we looked at existing research, we had many questions. Our questions focused on voices that hadn't been heard. We were interested in expanding the community of stakeholders, generating better Canadian ethnographic data, and placing the question of the Aguna within the larger question of Jewish divorce and listening to the voices of a broader Jewish community. Previous research had largely ignored the Canadian context. The current literature lacks a robust account of how the contingency and abuse of the religious process blunts or subverts legislative intentions or presents obstacles to solutions that depend on particular religious and civil contexts. We argue that scholarship has understated the problem by locating get abuse wholly within Orthodoxy and which most meaningfully occurs in the US and Israel. We further contend that previous scholarship has also significantly overframed the narrative of get abuse by focusing in as Jewish law as the problem, rabbinic inaction as the obstacle to resolving that problem, and focusing on specific halakhic solutions, for example, prenuptial agreements or specific civil law, thereby removing the debate from the larger context.
So in particular, our project, and these are just some quotes for you up on the screen, aims at what would be called a thick ethnographic approach, which learns from different respondents to develop a rich and complex account of particular cultural contexts and phenomena. Our methodology takes seriously the ways in which our project's validity depends on a broad circle of stakeholders who represent different social positions and experience the phenomenon of get abuse from a range of locations. Ethnographic methods are particularly useful in cases where quantitative research would be challenging to obtain. Our approach is informed by feminist standpoint theory and methods, as it is communities and not individuals who produce knowledge. At the same time, however, we are informed by legal ethnographic methods, which value interpretation over causal legal analysis and work with the inherent materiality of the law as shown in ethnographic processes themselves. Where ethnographic methods fail to facilitate data analysis focusing on the religious and cultural context of get abuse, we turn to oral historical methods to enable data analysis aimed at locating this phenomenon as a historical process. Oral history's emphasis on foregrounding individual narratives is particularly urgent, as in the case of get abuse, where women's voices are often marginalized or silenced.
Okay, I can see what's there. Our interviews point to a theoretical tension between defining Jewish divorce as an orthopraxy and the variability and contingencies of religious divorce practice in the modern Canadian context. Our original multidisciplinary theoretical framework, Troubling Orthopraxies, situates and substantively engages the civil, Jewish legal, and customary variables of Jewish divorce. So Judaism is often described as an orthopraxy. Orthopraxy, referring to correct practice, is contrasted with orthodoxy, or correct doctrine. We use our theory of troubling orthopraxies to conceptualize the ways in which correct practice, both asserted as stringency and subverted as necessary reform, becomes an organizing principle that frames the relationship between tradition, gendered persons, religious law, civil law, and community. And while this theoretical framework has emerged from our analysis of our Canadian interviews, transnational congruencies suggest the utility of this theory in broader contexts.
So now we're going to actually turn to tell you, give you some snapshots of what we have found from our preliminary pilot interviews in Ottawa itself. And one of the things about that which you'll notice is both the interdenominationality, but also the transnationality that's going to come up. And because personal status has become so publicly contested in recent years in both Israel and in the diaspora, there's increasing anxiety we found across all denominations that local solutions to the aguna problem may not be recognized as one moves to the right along the continuum of halachic stringency. The Canadian tendency towards conservatism and tradition only amplifies this concern. We heard again and again from non-Orthodox rabbis how non-observant couples would come to them asking for, and these were their words, a kosher or frum marriage, either because that's what they thought a real ceremony looked like, or because parents or one partner had that as the standard of an authentic Jewish wedding. Reform and conservative rabbis also showed this preference for what one rabbi called the frummest common denominator by encouraging Orthodox divorce practices as normative.
We heard of multiple cases where a Reform rabbi, and this would be a Reform rabbi in Ottawa who had previously come from the US, would be approached by an Orthodox man who asked to arrange a divorce. The rabbi explains he did so knowing full well that the spouse wouldn't accept it, but the court would. And this is because it happened in the US and New York State. A Reform divorce would not be considered kosher and would be halakhically invalid. The rabbi understood that the husband was trying to circumvent New York State law, providing a religious divorce that would still, in fact, keep his wife an aguna. Describing this as, quote, a backhanded aguna kind of craziness, the rabbi described how his synagogue decided to no longer offer gitin themselves and partnered with a non-denominational organization. This organization, Kayama, which many of you will be familiar with, is not itself affiliated with any particular denominational body, and it does not present itself as an Orthodox institution. However, 2/3 of its organizers come from modern Orthodox yeshivot. And so this is another dimension of the troubling orthopraxies we are seeing, a preference for correct practice that frames but also subverts and even overturns other organizing features of Jewish life.
Further, our conversations with respondents reflect the North American experience of denominational movement, both within and across generations. Although one might imagine that one is born, lives, marries, and divorces in the same denomination, our research highlights the ways in which people move between denominations for a variety of reasons, including geography, family commitments, the commitments of a new spouse, and/or changing personal observance. When these changes intersect with life events that impact on personal religious status in the Jewish context, that may often mean conflicting relationships with both traditional observance and halacha. We had many Canadian examples of this phenomenon, but the most dramatic, however, was an example from one respondent who was raised Reform, married the first time in a conservative synagogue, divorced through the Orthodox processes in Montreal, remarried Reform, ended that marriage through the interventions of Orthodox institutions by claiming that second marriage was not halachically valid because it was Reform, and then remarried Reform and showing the preference for the frummest common denominator had an Orthodox ceremony as well.
So why should we focus on this movement? Because when people imagine the problems associated with religious divorce, they're imagining fully unchanging relationship with halakha and that all stakeholders operate within the same halakhic perspective. People move in and out of halakhically observing settings and while also acting in ways that potentially change their halakhic status. Hearing these stories trouble existing narratives and illuminate the orthopraxy of how the halakhic system is necessarily normative. Sorry, I got lost. Therefore, it speaks beyond the borders of the halakhic world to stakeholders who both want its unconditional approval, but want it on their own liberal, modern terms.
One thing which we found overwhelmingly is that all of this is tied into anxieties over personal status for women, but particularly for future children, and that these in turn stem from interdenominational tensions over the halakhic recognition of marriage, gitin, and conversion. We heard repeatedly how from the Reform to the Orthodox world, although there was a clear preference for Orthodox divorce processes, willingness to attempt other solutions increased greatly when the couple in question were older and unlikely to have other children. This highlights a concern about children becoming mamzerim. However, our interview research confirms yet another troubling orthopraxy, which is that this process is permeable and responsive in the needs of children, but that the will to find a halachic solution is more muted when it comes to the women themselves. We found that the process is dependent on everyone working together and things working right. There's a saying in law, which many of you will have heard, which is that hard cases make bad law. But one of the things that we have found is that actually easy cases make bad law as well. If you look at the outlying cases, that means that you're not able to respond to those cases which actually are most responsive within the norm. And so the classic narrative about agunot is the aguna who's changed her marriage, and if only we didn't live in the modern world, and we heard this from several rabbis, if only we lived in an earlier time where Jewish life was determined and controlled by Jewish law and observance, then possibly we could find solutions and everything would work itself out. But to say that the process is contingent is to underscore two important dimensions. First, that the success of the divorce process is always dependent on the goodwill of the husband, and second, that all processes are contingent on human relationships in general, positive or negative, close or far.
So we have a story from the early 1970s that sounds almost like a movie, and it highlights how the ground has shifted for rabbis and for the women who struggle to get a get. Ottawa Rabbi, Rabbi Butler, describes how when he was a young rabbi in Ottawa, there was a man who he described as, quote, cagey and a sleazebag, who was refusing to give his wife a get. He enlisted the assistance of the rabbinical court in Montreal, and when they had intelligence that the husband would be at his home in Ottawa, they climbed in his bedroom window and declared to him, quote, "We're not leaving until you authorize the get." This cloak and dagger story continues as Rabbi Butler describes how, concerned that the man might revoke it, the others zipped off to Montreal, wrote the get, and it was transmitted to the lady, end quote. And while they stayed with the husband until it was complete, his position at the time was clear. This was not coercive. Quote, "We said we're not leaving, and we didn't hold a gun to his head." When asked if he would do it again, he demurs. "I'm not sure." And then he laughed that one might get arrested. But we know that should this happen today, there's a strong chance that the husband could protest to another court who might, for reasons of stringency or corruption, invalidate the divorce, leaving the woman as an aguna once again. That the contingency of the process depends on relationships comes out in a story about a Canadian woman living in Israel, who described how the delays from the Jerusalem Beit Din prompted her to threaten to return to Canada without her divorce. Both the husband's Israeli cousins and the wife's Canadian rabbi insist that they must divorce before she leaves the country. They each made phone calls, and suddenly there was a date for the Jerusalem court. She explains wryly, "It was the rabbis who knew other rabbis. It's a system of who you know." If the previous story illustrates how the process is contingent upon relationships, the opacity of the process permits contingencies, real or perceived.
Of course, as you know, there are common halachic standards, but one of the things that we found in our interviews was that the actual process of divorce can actually vary widely, and the lawyer and me geeked out over this quite a bit during the interviews. So that the process is both opaque to the women that experience it, but often misunderstood as well. We heard from one woman who described her bewilderment at the process. There were a lot of phone calls to New York, a lot of letters, emails. Again, being ignored, I had to pressure them, the Beit Din as well. Hello, where are we going with this? What are you doing? Why isn't he getting any repercussions, any consequences? And then all of a sudden I had a get. I don't really know what happened between point A and point B to make all of that happen. Rabbinic claims to orthopraxy of local or personal practice are also troubled by multiple accounts where practice varies, where women are not privy to the actual decision-making process that can either facilitate or hinder delivery of their get, and where women are too often ignorant of the correct practice or of their rights under that process. So even when correct process is followed, the process can still break down. For example, we spoke to a woman who described the process of ending an abusive marriage where she was encouraged to get her get as soon as possible, especially before leaving the city for a cross-country move. And as you'll see, this story illustrates not only the breakdown of the process, but the ways in which the process itself can be highly variable. So for this woman, her rabbi sent her to the only Beit Din in the city where she lived, and she recalls the process as both traumatic and alienating. She didn't know any of the men in the room who would be hearing her divorce, and she was required to sit alone in a room with her husband who had abused her to see if they might reconcile, classic shalom bayit. And years later, she expresses confusion and a lack of certainty about what actually happened and why. She just describes, I just remember the ceremony being very formal, a bit scary. There were these 3 old rabbis who didn't really communicate with me. This lack of communication is often key to the stories we hear. This particular woman describes how her ketubah was slashed symbolically during destroying her marriage. They put our ketubah up on the lectern, they took a razor, they sliced it up, and I'm sitting there ready to die. It was really awful. And then they gave it to him, and they made him give it to me.
So traditionally, it is the get itself that is defaced to ensure that it cannot be used for another couple, and which is handed back to the husband to give to the wife. However, slashing of the ketubah is a practice in some Chabad communities. And while she was not, to her knowledge, dealing with a Chabad community, because of the variability of the process, it's difficult to discern whether she misunderstood what was happening. Of course, that's possible. Or if this particular Beit Din actually did use this Chabad practice. We introduced this story as an example of how the process can break down. And in fact, she would only learn years later that one of the witnesses was not acceptable, and her get was actually invalid. At this point, as she put it, quote, she almost had a heart attack. What then? Would she need a new get? The rabbi responded, we will find a way to deal with this. And so the wife continued. And then he started asking me a whole series of questions. He asked me if I had pictures from the wedding, which I did not. He asked me if anybody Orthodox and Shomer had attended the wedding, which I didn't really think so. He said, okay, we're good. And so the marriage technically didn't happen. And although the rabbi did find a solution, this case began with a decision to retroactively invalidate someone's divorce, which could have led to a child being declared a mamzer. And as terrible as that would have been, let us not let that scenario distract us from the actual harm that this woman experienced, nor the ways that being rendered aguna would have compounded the abuse she had already suffered.
So the stories we've heard have been really touching and often heartbreaking, and they speak to the challenges that real people face as they try to engage in this ancient process. They speak to the ways in which modernity has complicated that process and our own relationships to it. And while many of the themes may be universal and many of the factors are transnational, our stories are actually rooted in the Canadian context. Attention to different national contexts allows us to parse out those variables that are rooted in transnational halachic practice and those that may be local, customary, or contingent. The assertion of orthopraxy as a defense against get abuse of reform is troubled by these findings, which talk to us about the inherent pluralism of the religious practice in the Canadian context. So, thank you.
Thank you so much.